She thought her last name would protect her. But when the daughter of the U.S. Attorney General is framed and locked away in a ruthless juvenile detention system, she realizes the law doesn't work the same for everyone. Her father has power, but will it be enough to fight the corrupt forces determined to keep her behind bars? If this could happen to the daughter of the most powerful lawyer in the country, imagine what happens to kids without a voice. Do you think the system is broken? Tell us in the comments and share this story, because every voice matters. The city was winding down for the night, its streets bathed in the soft glow of flickering streetlights. The distant hum of traffic mixed with the rustling of autumn leaves as a cool breeze swept through. 17-year-old Imani Carter walked with a steady pace, her thoughts lingering on the conversations she had just left behind. Tonight's meeting at the community center had run late. Another heated discussion about youth incarceration and the injustice of a system that punished the powerless. Despite being the daughter of U.S. Attorney General Samuel Carter, Imani never relied on her last name for protection or privilege. She had spent years carving her own path, working with advocacy groups that fought for wrongfully convicted teens, hoping to be a part of real change. She had seen firsthand how kids, some not much older than her, were swallowed by a machine that cared more about quotas than justice. But in just a few minutes, she would become one of them. The sudden flash of headlights cut through the darkness, blinding her for a split second. The low rumble of an approaching engine grew louder before a police cruiser screeched to a stop beside her. Imani stopped, her pulse quickened. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She knew that. But knowing didn't always mean being safe. A voice crackled through the patrol car's loudspeaker. "You there? Hands where we can see them." A chill ran down her spine. Slowly she turned, her hands instinctively raising just enough to show compliance. Two officers stepped out. Officer Travis Burke, a thick-set man with a permanent scowl, rested a hand on his holstered gun. His partner, Michael Dawson, younger but carrying an unmistakable air of arrogance, adjusted his belt as he approached. "What's the problem, officers?" Imani's voice was measured, controlled. Years of watching her father handle high-pressure situations had taught her to stay calm, to never escalate. Burke's gaze swept over her, cold and assessing. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle nearby," he said. "Suspect matches your description." "A stolen car?" Imani's stomach twisted. "That's impossible," she said firmly. "I just left the community center. There are witnesses who can confirm that." Dawson took another step forward, casually rolling his shoulders like he had all the time in the world. "We'll sort that out at the station. I haven't done anything wrong." Burke exhaled sharply, as if tired of the conversation. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Imani's breath caught. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She took a step back. "I have the right to." Before she could finish, Burke grabbed her wrist and yanked it behind her back. Cold metal snapped around her skin. "You can call whoever you want after booking." Her heart pounded against her ribs as she felt the unmistakable weight of the cuffs tightening. Her mind screamed for her to resist, but her body knew better. Stay calm. Don't resist. Survive. But deep down, she already knew. This wasn't a mistake. This was something else. The ride to Greystone Juvenile Detention Center was a blur of flashing streetlights, the rhythmic crackle of the police radio, and the suffocating grip of fear. Imani stared blankly out the patrol car's window, watching the world outside continue as if nothing was wrong, as if a girl wasn't being taken away for a crime she didn't commit. When the cruiser pulled up to the facility's towering metal gates, a blinding floodlight washed over the gravel lot, making the building ahead look even more cold and unwelcoming. A figure stood waiting outside, arms folded. Warden Draper. The man barely looked at her as Burke handed over the paperwork. There was no sign of curiosity, no hesitation, just a slow nod, like this was routine, like she was just another case file to be processed. That was the first red flag. The second? The way the intake officer scribbled down information without ever asking for her ID. "Name," he droned, barely glancing up. Imani hesitated. "They know who I am. They have to." "Imani Carter." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Silence. No reaction. The officer kept writing. No questions. No confirmation. Her stomach knotted. This isn't an oversight. This is intentional. She turned to Burke, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he was already leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, a smug smirk playing on his lips. They knew, and they were ignoring it. Her hands clenched into fists. She wasn't just being detained, she was being erased. A slow, creeping realization settled over her like ice. She wasn't here by accident. Someone wanted her here. The heavy metal door clanged shut, sealing Imani inside a world she had only ever read about. A world she had fought against, and now she was trapped in it. A female guard shoved a stiff orange jumpsuit into her arms, her face blank, indifferent. "Get dressed. You have 5 minutes." The fabric felt rough against her fingers, like sandpaper designed to scrape away everything she used to be. Imani hesitated, gripping the jumpsuit tighter. The guard exhaled sharply. "Move. Now." Imani swallowed her pride and turned toward the changing room, knowing there was no point in arguing. Not here. Not now. But as she changed, she knew this was only the beginning. When she stepped out, the reality of Greystone hit her like a punch to the gut. Rows of metal bunk beds filled the dormitory, some occupied by girls no older than 13, their faces hard with quiet defiance, or worse, hollow with defeat. The air was thick with an unspoken hierarchy, the kind that wasn't written in any rulebook, but was understood by everyone who had been there long enough to learn the cost of breaking it. And the guards? They barely looked at the girls as people. Imani saw it firsthand the next morning. She had just stepped into the cafeteria when a sharp whistle cut through the air. "You think this is a buffet?" A guard's voice carried through the room. Imani turned just in time to see a girl, thin, barely 15, freeze in place, clutching a carton of milk. Officer Burke. His uniform was crisp, his bulky frame blocking her path. He held out a hand, wiggling his fingers. The girl hesitated. "Hand it over." Slowly, she extended the milk. Burke took it, then casually dropped it onto the floor. The white liquid splattered across her shoes, pooling around her trembling feet. "Clean it up." A muscle in Imani's jaw twitched. It wasn't about the milk, it was about power. The girl knelt, using her sleeve to mop up the mess. No one spoke. No one looked. They all knew better. Burke smirked, satisfied. Imani's stomach churned. She tried to keep her head down, watching, learning. She had to be smart. But when she saw Naomi, a frail, quiet girl, get shoved against a wall by 2 bigger inmates, something in her cracked. "Hey," Imani's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The 2 girls turned, eyes narrowing. "Mind your business," one of them muttered. Imani didn't move. She knew how this worked. She wasn't naive. But she also knew that if she let this happen, if she ignored it like everyone else, she'd be no different from them. The girls lingered a moment longer, then scoffed and walked away. Naomi looked up, her face a mixture of gratitude and fear. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. Imani started to respond, but then she felt it. A presence watching her. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch Burke's eyes locked onto hers from across the room. And then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even an amused one. The kind of smile that carried a warning. A slow, creeping realization settled in Imani's chest. She had just made herself a target. And in this place, that could be deadly. The house was still. Not the usual comfortable stillness of a home winding down for the night, but the kind that felt wrong. Heavy. Suffocating. U.S. Attorney General Samuel Carter sat in his study, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting harsh shadows across the stacks of legal briefs and case files in front of him. Normally, he found solace in the quiet hours after midnight, time to strategize, to think. But tonight, his mind was somewhere else. He glanced at the clock, 1:37 a.m. Imani should have been home hours ago. At first, he'd dismissed the worry. She was 17, independent, responsible. Maybe she'd lost track of time. Maybe her phone had died. But now, a cold unease curled in his gut. Something was wrong. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. 1 ring, 2, 3, straight to voicemail. Samuel exhaled slowly, forcing his mind to stay rational. She probably just fell asleep at a friend's house. But that wasn't Imani. She always called. His fingers tightened around the phone. Stay calm. Find answers. And when logic failed, use power. By 1:45 a.m., Samuel was standing in his home office, phone pressed to his ear, calling in favors from people who didn't say no to him. "Agent Dawson, I need you to check all hospital and police reports for my daughter's name. Immediately." The agent on the other end hesitated, his voice thick with sleep. "Sir, is there a reason to suspect Just do it. A pause. Then the sound of papers shuffling, a keyboard clacking. Samuel clenched his jaw, pacing the room as the seconds dragged. Then, the agent's voice came back on the line. No reports under her name, sir. Samuel stopped pacing. That didn't make sense. If she'd been in an accident, if she'd been arrested, there should be a record, unless someone didn't want there to be one. His grip on the phone tightened. Check unidentified juvenile detainees. More typing. A longer pause. Then, the hesitation in Dawson's voice told him everything. Sir, we do have an entry for an unidentified juvenile female brought in 6 hours ago. No name, no details, just listed as processed. Samuel felt his blood run cold. Someone had erased his daughter. By 2:15 a.m., Samuel was fully in Attorney General mode, and that was bad news for whoever was behind this. His fingers flew across his phone as he made 3 calls in rapid succession. The first, to his chief of staff. Wake up every DOJ official who needs to be awake. We have a situation. The second, to the deputy director of the FBI. I need eyes on a juvenile detention center tonight. Amani's missing, and someone tried to erase her. The third, to the Secretary of Homeland Security. I don't care what strings need to be pulled. Find out who ordered this. Within minutes, the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country were in motion. By 2:30 a.m., a team of federal analysts was combing through arrest logs, phone records, surveillance feeds, whatever it took. By 2:45 a.m., an emergency intelligence briefing had been called. By 3 a.m., Samuel Carter had one mission. He wasn't just going to find his daughter. He was going to burn down the system that had taken her. The Department of Justice's war room was silent except for the steady hum of computer monitors and the low murmurs of analysts piecing together fragments of data. The air felt charged, heavy, like the moments before a storm. Samuel Carter stood at the head of the long, polished table, his hands pressed against the surface, his jaw locked in a way that sent an unspoken message. Someone was going to pay for this. Across from him, Jessica Reed, his lead investigator, pulled up a file on the massive display screen. A name flashed across it in bold letters. Judge Preston Calloway. A man hailed for his tough-on-crime stance, praised for cleaning up the streets with harsh sentencing on juvenile offenders. A man who, on paper, had dedicated his life to justice. But Samuel knew justice had nothing to do with it. What do we have? His voice was low, measured, but it carried the weight of a man who expected answers. Reed clicked to the next slide. Bank statements. Hundreds of thousands of dollars wired into offshore accounts, each transaction leading back to one source, a private prison corporation. Reed's voice was clipped, professional, but Samuel could hear the disgust beneath it. For the past decade, Calloway has been funneling thousands of juvenile offenders into privately run detention centers. She exhaled sharply. And making millions off of it. Another slide. A list of sentencing records. David Carter, a young analyst, no relation, swallowed hard. Sir, the racial breakdown of his cases is... He hesitated, then exhaled. It's nearly 90% Black and Latino youth. A heavy silence settled in the room. Samuel's grip on the table tightened. This wasn't about crime. His voice was quieter now, but sharper, like a blade being drawn. This was a business model. He looked at the numbers, the names, children Calloway had thrown away for profit. Now they had taken his daughter. Jessica Reed hesitated before pulling up the next file. More emails. Correspondence between Calloway and an unknown sender. Sir, we don't believe Imani's arrest was a coincidence. Samuel's gaze snapped to her. Explain. She clicked into the message thread. Lines of text filled the screen. A conversation. Carefully worded, but the meaning was clear. They didn't just take Imani to silence her. They took her to control him. The realization hit Samuel like a slow-moving wrecking ball. This wasn't just about her. This was about him. The room felt colder. Someone in the intelligence division shifted uncomfortably, aware of the moment's weight. Samuel straightened, his shoulders squared like a man who had just locked onto a target. They think they can use my daughter as leverage? His voice was quiet, dangerous. They have no idea who they're dealing with. Jessica exhaled. There's one more thing. She pulled up another photo, a man in his late 40s, tired eyes, a uniform that no longer carried the same weight. Nathan Grant, a former officer, a man who had spent years working under Judge Calloway. Samuel studied his face, a man who had seen too much. He's willing to testify? Jessica nodded. Yes, but there's a problem. She clicked to another slide. Grainy surveillance footage. Nathan Grant stepping out of his house. A second figure lurking in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. Samuel's stomach tightened. They know he's talking. A slow, controlled breath. The kind of breath a man takes before he declares war. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and stale grease. The hum of a flickering neon sign buzzed outside, casting fractured red light through the rain-streaked window. Nathan Grant sat in the corner booth, his back pressed against the worn vinyl seat, his eyes darting to the door every time it creaked open. He wasn't paranoid. Not when men like Judge Calloway had everything to lose. Not when he'd already seen the same fear in the faces of the kids Calloway had sentenced, boys who never made it home, girls who disappeared into the system. Grant checked his phone. 3:09 a.m. A single message flashed on the screen. We're 5 minutes out. Stay put. His hand trembled as he set the phone down. The plan was simple. Federal protection, a full deposition, and then he'd finally tell the truth. But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered, 5 minutes is a long time. The bell above the door jingled. A man stepped inside, shaking off the rain. Nathan's breath caught. Not because he recognized him, but because the man didn't look around. Didn't check the menu. Didn't hesitate. Just walked straight toward him. Nathan pushed back from the table, his body already moving before his brain could catch up. His hand went to his phone. A desperate attempt to send one last message. He never got the chance. The gun was already raised. A muffled shot. The world blurred. Pain exploded in his chest. He slumped back, the warmth of his coffee spilling over his lap, mixing with something darker. His last thought wasn't fear. It was regret. 3:14 a.m. The phone buzzed on Samuel Carter's desk, piercing the heavy silence of his study. He had barely slept. His mind wouldn't let him. The files spread before him told a story of corruption so deep, so systemic that it made even him, a man who had spent decades prosecuting criminals, pause. He reached for his phone. Unknown caller. A slow breath. Then he answered. Silence. And then a voice. Smooth, controlled, empty. Walk away. Samuel's grip on the phone tightened, his fingers pressing into the plastic. Who is this? The voice remained calm. Turn on your television. Samuel reached for the remote. The screen flickered to life. Breaking news. A former police officer found dead in a local diner. Single gunshot wound to the chest. Nathan Grant. Samuel's pulse didn't quicken, didn't break, but something inside him shifted. A dangerous, quiet rage settled into his bones. The voice returned. This is your only warning. Drop the case, walk away before it's too late. A slight pause, then the final blow, before she disappears for good. Click. The line went dead. Samuel stared at the screen. A reporter's voice droned on about a tragic incident, about how the police had no suspects, no leads, the usual script. Nathan Grant was dead, executed, and that meant one thing, he had been right. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his fingers laced together in perfect stillness, a calculated quiet. This was no longer just about Judge Calloway, no longer just about private prisons. This was about power, about control, about silencing anyone who dared to threaten the machine. And now, they had just declared war on the wrong man. The courtroom was packed. Too packed, the kind of packed that didn't happen by accident. The air buzzed with hushed conversations, reporters whispering behind their notepads, spectators shifting in their seats. But there was no real tension, no uncertainty, because everyone here, except for one man, already knew the outcome. Judge Preston Calloway sat high on his bench, his expression carved from stone. No unnecessary words, no wasted movement. This wasn't a trial, it was a formality. A box to check before he buried Imani Carter under a guilty verdict. Samuel Carter sat in the back row, arms crossed. He had seen rigged cases before, but this was an execution, dressed up in legal procedure. He exhaled slowly, watching as the state-appointed prosecutor strode toward the jury box. Young, ambitious, owned. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor began, his voice smooth, practiced. This case is simple. The defendant, Imani Carter, was found near the scene of a violent carjacking. A victim has identified her as the perpetrator. The evidence is undeniable. Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. Undeniable? The only thing undeniable was the stench of corruption filling this room. The prosecution wasted no time. The first witness, Officer Travis Burke. He took the stand, sitting with a casual arrogance, his uniform neatly pressed, his posture relaxed, like a man who had no fear of consequences. I observed the suspect acting suspiciously in the area. When approached, she attempted to flee. Samuel's hands tightened into fists. A lie. He knew Imani hadn't run. He had raised her better than that. She had stood her ground. She had demanded answers. Burke leaned forward, looking straight at the jury. Her behavior was consistent with someone who had just committed a crime. Samuel's jaw clenched. Not a single piece of real evidence. Just vague, subjective language. A script Burke had probably used dozens of times before. The next witness entered the stand. The so-called victim. A middle-aged man. Conservative suit. A demeanor carefully crafted to appear sincere but not overly emotional. I saw her face clearly that night. I have no doubt she's the one who attacked me. Samuel leaned forward, his sharp gaze locked on the man's face. He knew a liar when he saw one. This man had never seen Imani before in his life. A murmur rippled through the jury. The effect was working. The public defender stood up, a man who already knew he had lost before he began. He cleared his throat, flipping through thin case notes that were never going to be enough. Samuel studied him carefully. A rookie, overworked, underfunded, and worst of all, he looked scared. He asked a few predictable questions, tried to poke holes in the so-called victim's statement. The man held firm, well-rehearsed. The defense barely made a dent. Samuel exhaled slowly. They think this is over. They think they've already won. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated who they were really up against. The tension in the courtroom was a living thing, thick, suffocating, unrelenting. Judge Calloway's gavel came down in sharp, controlled movements. The prosecution may proceed. Samuel Carter leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His face was calm, too calm. A storm was coming. Your Honor, he said, rising from his seat. His voice was steady, measured. Before this court continues its rush to judgment, I have newly discovered evidence. Evidence that does not just affect this case, but exposes a conspiracy at the heart of our justice system. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Calloway's fingers tightened around his gavel. This trial is not a platform for baseless accusations, Mr. Carter. Samuel turned to him, his gaze unwavering. No, it's a place for the truth. And then he pulled out the flash drive. The moment Samuel placed the device in the evidence reader, the energy in the room shifted. Even the prosecutor tensed. The speakers crackled. Then, a voice. Shaky, but clear. If you're hearing this, it means they failed. A sharp gasp came from the jury box. Nathan Grant. They're gonna kill me for this, but I can't stay silent anymore. The room fell into absolute silence. I've seen what Calloway does. He rigs cases, pushes long sentences on kids, black kids, Latino kids. The detention centers pay him for every head he sends. It's a business. It's always been a business. Judge Calloway's face remained impassive, but his knuckles turned white where they gripped the bench. I arrested Imani Carter that night and I knew she was innocent, but I had my orders. We all did. They think they can bury this. They think they can bury me. But if you're hearing this, a deep breath from Grant, it means they didn't. The recording ended. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, chaos. Over the commotion, Samuel's voice rang out. Your Honor, the prosecution has relied on manipulated evidence and a false witness. I'd like to present someone who will tell this court the truth. The back doors of the courtroom creaked open. A woman stepped inside. Lisa Monroe. Judge Calloway visibly stiffened. He knew who she was. Lisa walked slowly to the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she took the oath. The silence that followed felt unbearable. I used to work for Judge Calloway, she said, voice thin but steady. For years, I processed cases in his courtroom. I saw everything. She swallowed hard. Kids came in on minor charges and left with sentences that made no sense. Cases that should have been dismissed, but weren't. Families that begged for mercy, but never got it. Her eyes flicked to Calloway, and for the first time he looked away. At first I told myself it wasn't my place to question it. But then I started noticing the patterns. The money. The private prison contracts. She exhaled, her voice breaking slightly. I should have spoken up sooner, but I was scared. A pause. Then she turned to face the jury. I am not scared anymore. Judge Calloway slammed his gavel down, his voice sharp. Enough! This is irrelevant to the matter at hand. Samuel took a step forward, his expression unreadable. Irrelevant? His voice was quiet, deadly. You are the matter at hand, Judge. Reporters in the back row scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to disappear. The jury? They weren't looking at Imani anymore. They were looking at Calloway. Then, as if on cue, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Federal agents, moving with precise, practiced efficiency, they approached the bench, the lead agent holding a sealed warrant. Judge Calloway, by order of the Department of Justice, you are hereby placed under investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. A sharp collective inhale echoed through the courtroom. For the first time, Calloway looked shaken. He shot a glance toward the prosecutor, a silent plea for intervention. None came. He turned to Samuel. His voice was quiet, but filled with venom. You think you've won? Samuel didn't flinch. No, he said simply. Justice has. Calloway pushed back from his bench, his face twisted with rage. But this was no longer his courtroom. The system he had spent years controlling had finally turned against him, and he couldn't stop it. The courtroom was packed, not with spectators seeking justice, but with those who once feared this man. The same marble floors Calloway had once walked across with authority now carried the sound of shackles clinking against his ankles. He was no longer Judge Preston Calloway. No longer the untouchable king of his courtroom. Now, he was a prisoner. The guards led him to the defense table, where he lowered himself into the chair with rigid, forced composure. Samuel Carter watched from the front row, his face unreadable. He had fought too many battles to let emotion overtake him now. But as the gavel struck, he couldn't ignore the weight of this moment. For the first time, the system Calloway had corrupted was holding him accountable. Calloway's arrest was just the first crack. Then, the dam burst. 12 judges across multiple states were implicated. Over 50 police officers were placed under investigation for fabricating evidence. Private prison executives, some of the wealthiest men in the country, were charged with conspiracy and bribery. The corruption was not just deep, it was deliberate, engineered, profitable. Breaking news: FBI uncovers nationwide sentencing scandal. Judicial system in crisis as corruption cases skyrocket. Children were the currency. Protests erupted. Parents who had spent years begging for justice for their children stood in front of courthouses, demanding accountability. Survivors of the system came forward. One by one they spoke. Of years lost, of innocence stolen, of dreams crushed under the weight of a judge's gavel. For the first time, their voices could not be ignored. When the verdict was read, Calloway did not react. Guilty, on all counts. Bribery, fraud, racketeering, conspiracy. The sentence? Life. The weight of those words hung in the air. For the first time in decades, a judge who had wielded power like a weapon had been stripped of it. Samuel Carter watched as Calloway stood, his posture still rigid, refusing to show weakness. But there was something different now. His power was gone. The guards moved to take him away, but before he turned, he cast one last look at Samuel. His voice, though quiet, dripped with venom. You really think this changes anything? Samuel met his gaze, unmoved, unshaken. He stood, stepping closer. No. A pause. Then, with quiet conviction, it already has. Calloway's mouth pressed into a thin line. For the first time, his mask slipped. The guards led him away, and with the slam of the heavy courtroom doors behind him, the era of Preston Calloway was over. The metal gates groaned open, revealing the world beyond. Sunlight streamed through, harsh and unfiltered, almost too bright after months under fluorescent prison lights. Imani Carter stood at the threshold, her arms wrapped around the small bag of belongings they had given back to her. She should feel relieved. She should feel free. But all she felt was empty. A hand touched her shoulder, warm, familiar. She turned. Samuel Carter, her father. For the first time in months, she saw him not as the U.S. Attorney General, not as the man who had fought the system for her, but as her dad. His eyes, normally so sharp and commanding, were now filled with something else. Relief and guilt. Without a word, he pulled her into a tight embrace. Imani didn't resist, but she didn't melt into it either. Something inside her had changed. She was walking toward the car when she heard it. A voice from behind the gates. Hey, Carter! Imani turned. Through the bars, a familiar face. Sasha Green. The girl she had spent months with inside these walls. A girl who wasn't leaving today. Sasha grinned, but it didn't reach her eyes. She pressed something through the bars, a folded piece of paper. Imani hesitated, then took it. I heard about what your dad did, Sasha said, voice quieter now. Guess you really weren't like the rest of us. The words stung, but Imani didn't argue, because Sasha wasn't wrong. Imani was going home. Sasha was staying behind, and so were so many others. Imani unfolded the paper in the back seat of her father's car. The handwriting was messy, hurried, but full of meaning. Carter, you told me not to give up, to fight. I thought you were just saying that, but now I see you meant it. I don't know what happens next, but because of you, I still have hope. Don't forget about us, Sasha. The ink blurred as Imani stared at the words. She blinked rapidly, pushing back the wave of emotions tightening her throat. She had spent so long fighting to get out. Now, she realized her fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The lecture hall buzzed with quiet energy. The soft shuffle of textbooks opening, the rhythmic clicking of keyboards, the low murmur of students preparing for class. Imani Carter sat near the front, her fingers wrapped around a pen, not to take notes, but to ground herself. The weight of where she was, what she was doing, it settled into her chest like an anchor. She glanced around at the faces beside her. Some were here because they had always dreamed of this. Some because their parents expected it. But she was here for something different. For Sasha. For every child whose name had been buried in files labeled case closed. For herself. A professor strode to the podium, clearing his throat. Welcome to constitutional law. Let's begin. Imani sat up straighter. Her new fight had just begun. Later that evening, she sat across from her father at their kitchen table. For the first time in months, there were no walls between them. No bars, no shackles, just father and daughter. Samuel studied her for a long moment, then set down his coffee cup. You know this fight isn't over, right? Imani met his gaze unwavering. I know. Samuel sighed, running a hand over his face. The system doesn't change overnight. The people behind it, they don't give up power easily. A pause. Then, a small, knowing smile. Neither do I. Her father exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Pride, worry. A lifetime of battles fought, and now, knowing his daughter was stepping onto the same battlefield. You remind me of someone, he muttered. Imani raised an eyebrow. Someone brilliant, I assume. Samuel smirked. Someone stubborn. A beat of silence passed between them. Then, Imani reached for her laptop, flipping it open. A case file appeared on the screen. A new name, a new injustice. A new fight. Samuel sighed. Imani grinned. Better get used to it, Dad. I'm just getting started. The heavy wooden doors of the lecture hall swung shut behind Imani, closing out the world behind her. She took a slow breath, letting the weight of this moment settle. For months, she had lived in a cell where freedom was just a cruel illusion. Now she was here. Rows of students filled the lecture hall, some hunched over laptops, others lazily flipping through textbooks. The professor stood at the front, adjusting his glasses, completely unaware that this wasn't just another first-year law student sitting before him. Imani ran her fingers over the cover of her brand-new law textbook. It still smelled like fresh ink, like a beginning. She adjusted in her seat, a simple wooden chair, yet it felt strange, too soft, too unrestricted. She wasn't used to comfort anymore. Her mind drifted, back to the cold metal benches of the detention center, the endless echoes of doors slamming shut. Some of the girls in there had told her, "You'll forget about us the moment you walk out." She hadn't. She wouldn't. The professor cleared his throat, his voice sharp yet steady. Welcome to constitutional law. Let's begin. Imani gripped her pen, her heart steady. She wasn't just here to study the law. She was here to change it. Later that night, Imani sat across from her father at the kitchen table. For the first time in months, they weren't separated by walls, by lawyers, by fear. Just father and daughter. Samuel Carter watched her carefully. His coffee sat untouched in front of him, steam curling in the air, but he wasn't thinking about coffee. He was thinking about what came next. Finally, he spoke. You know this fight isn't over, right? Imani met his gaze without hesitation. I know. Samuel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. The system doesn't change overnight. The people behind it, they don't give up power easily. A pause, a breath, a knowing look. Then a small determined smile. Neither do I. Samuel let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Imani knew that look. It was the same one he had when he was building a case, piecing together evidence, preparing for a fight he knew would be long, exhausting, and brutal, but worth every second. Pride, worry, A lifetime of battles fought, and now, knowing his daughter was stepping onto the same battlefield, he studied her carefully. She wasn't the same girl who had walked into that courtroom in handcuffs. She had been forged in fire, and she had come out stronger. "You remind me of someone," he muttered. Imani raised an eyebrow. "Someone brilliant, I assume." Samuel smirked. "Someone stubborn." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was full. Then, Imani reached for her laptop, flipping it open. A case file appeared on the screen. She turned it toward her father. Samuel's brow furrowed. "What's this?" "Her name is Elena," Imani said softly. 16 years old, first offense, 5 years in juvenile detention for stealing a phone. Samuel inhaled sharply, recognition flickering in his eyes. It was the same story, different name, different face, same injustice. Imani leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "You were right, Dad. The system doesn't change overnight." She tilted her head slightly. "But I don't plan on waiting that long." Samuel sighed, shaking his head. Imani grinned. "Better get used to it, Dad. I'm just getting started." If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Your support means the world to us. It's what keeps us creating stories that matter, stories that inspire change. Every like, share, and comment helps us reach more people and bring more voices to light. So, what do you think about Imani's journey? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next story.